Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invite listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode concludes our conversation with Pam Bruns, Kristin Gazarians, Ren Chong, and Clementine Koss of the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force of Southern California. They explore how universal human rights standards and norms can be deployed to address local human rights issues such as the impact of climate change, along with the importance of engaging young people as human rights activists while offering suggestions on how to advance human rights education in the U.S. based upon their task force work since 1999. Now, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, he once said that all politics is local. And I want to get your opinion. We'll start with Pam and then go to Kristin and then back to Ren and Clementine. I want to get your opinion about that statement because many human rights issues in the United States are not classified as human rights issues. I'll give you an example. They may talk about the idea of children and child labor as a civil rights issue or as a child labor issue, but they don't use the conversation. They don't bring it into human rights many times. The same thing happens with healthcare. I think it's fair to say that Senator Sanders from Vermont was the key in raising that issue as a human rights issue over the last 5 years. But before that, you'd have to struggle to find anybody calling healthcare a human right. So my question is this: how do you take the idea of human rights and bring it to the local community in a way that doesn't become off-putting, but also starts them to think about what it means to say it's a human right, not just a child labor issue or a civil right or healthcare? We'll start with Pam.
Well, I think we go back to thinking about how a young child, a 5-year-old on the kindergarten playground will tell you that's not fair, or this isn't fair. That's not right to teach somebody, treat somebody like that. And I think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although some of the specifics don't say something about climate change, you can find within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights coverage of how we live, almost every aspect of how we live. And so I think when students start to talk about these issues, it starts off that way. This is something that's not fair. And you move on to the fact, well, in fact, it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or it's in this treaty that the United States may or may not have signed. And that's where the organizing principle is. That's where the backbone is for when you talk about rights. But I think the starting point is just that sense, that intuitive sense that I find all students have and start to lose it as they become older people, that they recognize, wait, this isn't right. This is really not fair. This isn't fair. And I think when we can discuss things that way, it definitely is local. And if students can help adults understand that, then we're really, really making progress. And as far as Tip O'Neill and all, politics are all local, that's really true. I try to tell the kids, there's another phrase about, politics begins with a person standing behind you in line in the grocery store. And that's true human rights. You can talk about human rights and what's affecting us and what's important for us to pay attention to. You start with the person at your dinner table with your family. You talk to your friends when you're eating lunch. you talk to your little sisters and your big brothers and whoever they might be. It's very local. It's very personal. And I think it's when we let the lawyers take over and legalese everything, that's when I think it becomes remote and we don't see our connection to it.
Kristin?
I know that nobody else can see us, but I laughed pretty hard when Pam just talked about it's at the dinner table, because last night I had dinner with family and friends that the entire conversation started in politics and then went to religion and then went to human right to abortion. And so I think for most of us in Student Task Force, human rights is very local. We live and breathe it. It's part of our daily lives, whether we're in school, we're at work, we're with our family, friends, we're reading the news, we're watching a movie, we're seeing human rights everywhere. And when it becomes part of our vocabulary, others start to pick up those same words. So whether this needs to happen through education in a classroom setting where teachers are using human rights vocabulary in the classroom instead of saying civil rights, it's human rights, or however we need to phrase it. For me, that's kind of where it starts. It's local because it's in ourselves, in the individual, who then share that with those around them, and then that grows and grows. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, sure. Ren, go ahead.
First, absolutely agree with everything Kristin and Pam are saying. They probably can say it way better than I can. But I absolutely do feel that it really just starts with the individual. One thing that I've learned really, really works whenever you're talking about any sort of human rights is that you have to first humanize all of these experiences that people are going through. When you talk about tragedies that might be overseas and super far from people, they don't care as much until you put a name and a face to these tragedies, because then it becomes real. It becomes real people going through real experiences. And that's what really gets people to care and empathize for their communities around them. And oftentimes, these tragedies that we talk about in terms of human rights violations are so close to home, but we don't realize it. I know people who are personally affected by some of these campaigns that we go through, and it's about sharing each other's experiences that makes it so local and that makes it so human. Because then when we understand that we're all going through things that are related to human rights and that are related to human rights violations, then it's hard for people to not care.
Clementine?
Yeah, so on the point of human rights education being local, I think that because human rights is, like everyone said, such an individual thing, so is human rights education. Because what human rights education does is that it gives you the human rights lens to all of these different social issues and how it impacts those people. So like Kristin was saying, instead of just thinking of abortion, then you're thinking about the human right to abortion and how that's something that like every human deserves because it's part of healthcare. And it gives you that perspective and just that shift of social justice issues. I hope that makes sense, but yeah.
So let me try to put it in a context of 3 words: understanding, compassion, and advocacy. And I've heard these, maybe not those words, but I've heard those 3 things brought forward in our conversation so far. I want to focus right now briefly, though, on understanding. It seems to me, both Ren and Clementine, you've talked about the fact that many of your teachers don't have very much background in human rights. Would that be fair?
That's about right.
Yes.
So how do you advance their understanding? For example, do you want the University of California, Berkeley to run a course at your school for the teachers? Would you like experts from Human Rights Watch to come and do a lecture series in the community? What are some ideas to advance understanding of the adults at this point? And I'm going to go with Ren first and then Clementine.
I honestly think inviting guest speakers from organizations like Human Rights Watch would be an excellent idea. What we've been trying to create at our high school that we haven't had much luck in was a mandatory training course for teachers on how to handle specifically issues related to LGBTQ youth, because teachers, they typically tend to be a few generations away from the classes that they're teaching. And as a result, they have less experience, less firsthand knowledge of what these children and what these youth are going through. So things like trainings or lectures, things that are going to be able to humanize and educate at the same time, that's so necessary for teachers, because they may not realize it, but they need also to be constantly expanding their worldview in order to keep up with the people that they're teaching.
Clementine?
Yeah, so as a student, I mean, teachers are have a really big impact on their students. Sometimes if a student has a really strong bond with their teachers, they can kind of become mentors. And I think that it's really important for teachers to have a deep understanding of what issues are impacting their students. So like Ren was talking about, all of the LGBTQ plus things that are happening across the US and how that might impact a student that's in your class, or how maybe someone comes from immigrant parents and how that might impact them. So I think it's just workshops or guest speakers, more than understanding just human rights as a whole to understand it, but to also have a deeper understanding of the students and the people that they're teaching and the experiences that they may have gone through.
So to know their community in a way that would allow them to have a conversation about human rights that could advance making the quality of life better. Would that be fair?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me turn now to Pam and Kristin. Given your years of experience in looking back at the task force and also your other experiences with human rights, as you know, throughout the United States now, human rights education is not as central to the curriculum as many other aspects of social studies are, or other parts of the curriculum, language arts, science. However, given your experience, what are some insights or conclusions you would draw about how to advance human rights education, given where we are right now? I'll start with Pam.
Well, I think all the efforts that we're talking about that STF has made are certainly important, but really to make a national impact, I think the whole teachers force has to have human rights as part of their teacher preparation. I think if I had a golden wand, human rights wand to wave over the United States, I would make human rights education a requirement of a teacher credential. It doesn't guarantee the way the teacher will incorporate that information, but it would certainly give us a better chance to have teachers reflect this in their education that they provided, whether it was in biology or mathematics or social studies. And again, that organizing principle to help put some organization around this very, very vast term, human rights, which covers everything. And barring that, I mean, we've made an effort. STF has done presentations at a local university to the teachers there, and to try to introduce it into their teacher training. Made some effort at it, but that's really an independent push that I don't know who that comes from. I know HRE has had this discussion before, Bill, with people, and there has been a kind of a college project, but it's really hard once teachers get out and have their credential and they're teaching, hard to find the time in their schedules to tell them to volunteer to sit down and let us teach you some more things that you need to know. And I would ask you, did you come out of college ready to teach with human rights in your background? You're such an activist. I kind of think you must have already been an activist, but your human rights education, where did you acquire that for your teaching?
I had zero human rights education all through my undergraduate years. I actually became interested in it through my work on Holocaust studies.
Uh-huh.
And that I was integrating it into my work in the classroom teaching U.S. history. But then when Amnesty International chapter became an option at the school, I started it with students. And then it just got snowballed. I got very interested. All based on self-study, by the way. I never had a course in it.
Same for me.
So I think that's very typical, by the way. I don't think many people have had very much study at all, unless perhaps they were pursuing a political science degree and they took one course about international law or something like that. I mean, typically, study of human rights often was done in law schools. And so I think it's more widespread today, but still far from what it should be. Kristin, did you want to add to what Pam's commented?
I actually think you both just argued or discussed my main point of you don't have to be a classroom teacher to be a human rights education practitioner. I think that we all have it in us. Human rights education is everywhere. We all do it on a daily basis when we speak up for something that we think isn't right, or we hear about something in the news and we make those connections. I think for most of the individuals, it's about framing your thinking to recognize these issues as human rights based. And more so, I would just want to remind everyone that human rights education doesn't have to be complicated to be effective. And in the same way that Bill, you just shared that you are self-taught and learned it through your own advocacy. And I think that that's how Ren and Clementine do it as well I mean, you're not self-taught in the sense that you have a program like Student Task Force that's helping you. But I think that when we overcomplicate the concept of human rights education, it makes certain people, and we've heard this in teachers when we've done some of these trainings in the past, they get nervous that they're not experts in the topic. So then they get too nervous to try and have these conversations. And so I think for me, it's just about remembering that human rights education is simply talking to people about human rights and helping them understand these issues through that lens.
I think it's interesting what you said about the fact that you don't have to be a classroom teacher, because there are many environments where human rights education can happen. The course I teach at Rutgers, I get students from all backgrounds. It's not just teacher education. And I remember I had Nancy Flowers on a video conference, and she asked me the question, where would I put an emphasis on change in human rights education? My answer would be, I'd like to educate every member of the police force in this country about human rights. I feel that's an extremely pressing issue, given the amount of bias and violence that has been imposed, particularly on people of color in this country by the police. And again, many police do not do that. But I would say most people in law enforcement have very little understanding of the human rights framework and so forth. So if I had to put my money into it, my effort, I'd say they're very important. So there are different places it can be done. It can be done through religious organizations. It can be done through unions. It can be done through organizations like the 4-H. It could be done all around the country in different ways. I think it's a matter of how you sort of have that conversation. I'd like to go ahead, Clementine.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on to that. I think a really good way of starting with human rights education is at home, right? Just having conversations with your family members, especially if you guys have differing views. I think that that's a really great way to talk about different social issues from a human rights lens, and what human rights is, what that means, what it looks like. So with your siblings and your parents or your sons and daughters, just starting that conversation at home, and then maybe continuing that on with your friends. Because I think that just like starting with the people in your bubble, because then that branches out.
Ren, did you want to add?
I absolutely agree with Clementine. I think it's so important to be able to have these conversations with just the people around you, especially when every now and then it becomes a big issue in the news. You see all of these human rights violations and everybody's talking about it. it's super important then, especially to introduce that human rights perspective to these big issues instead of just looking at the sensationalism, instead rather focusing on the human rights perspective to all of these issues that are going on currently.
And I think it's also an important and significant issue that we understand how we have to be able to converse with people who disagree. Because too often, I think, particularly given the sort of silo effect of social media today, you can just talk to people who agree with you very easily, but you really need to be able to engage with other people in a rational engagement and conversation where you disagree, but you can agree to disagree. And you don't engage in personal attacks and so forth. You actually talk about issues in a way that will engage you and inform you as much as the other person. Clementine?
Yeah, so I think that by also having conversations with people that disagree with you, you're humanizing them, because I think so much in social media, both sides, they're kind of pinned as the evil or the crazy one. And I think when you actually sit down and have conversations with people that have, like completely different views than you may have, it gives you the opportunity to kind of understand where the other person is coming from. And then, like Ren was talking about earlier, I think that human rights lens, when you're talking about, issues that are blowing up in the news, it also gives you the opportunity to humanize the situation and humanize the people that are affected by that situation. And I think that that's really important. And I think that there's a really big lack of that. So,
Go ahead, Ren.
And just going back to talking with people you disagree with, most likely you'll find that you and this other person that you think you disagree with so much, you guys often will share a fundamental understanding of this situation, and you'll agree on basic things like people should have healthcare. Like, it's difficult to find people who genuinely would disagree with that isolated sentence. It's only when you start introducing politics and all sorts of different nuances, then that's where you become so polarized. But even with people you disagree with, you'll likely share the same empathy for humans that you find universally.
Right, and you're bringing up an important issue of compassion. You have to be able to sit in the other person's shoes, walk a mile in their shoes, and I think then you have a better understanding of their point of view. Well, let's go to our final question, which is our lightning round here. So I'm going to start with the number one, which is who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education? And you're going to start, Pam.
I looked at this question ahead of time and I couldn't think what the answer would be, and I still can't, because actually I can think of a lot of people. I think so many people, certainly that I met at Human Rights Watch, the researchers that go out in the field and do work that's dangerous and in some ways not very rewarding, because their work may not be seen by and convincing enough to the people that need to be convinced. Certainly those people have been influential. But I think probably it's hard to get away from Eleanor Roosevelt. So I think she'd probably come up for a lot of people. But the more I've been able to learn about Eleanor Roosevelt and her role of promoting human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, hard to get past Eleanor Roosevelt.
Okay, Kristin.
For me, it's Pam. Pam Bruns. She has been a wonderful mentor to me over the last 11 years, a wonderful friend and colleague, but really she helped me understand. I had already been practicing human rights education when I worked at Amnesty International, and when I was teaching English in Cambodia, I was pulling in human rights vocabulary, but I never thought of it as human rights education through that same lens. And spending the last 11 years working with her and seeing all the different ways that we can implement it, she's really helped shape my understanding of human rights and human rights education in a way that I don't think she actually knows.
Okay, Clementine, you're next.
yeah, so I have a couple of answers for this one. So before I joined STF and had a really full understanding of what human rights was I was incredibly inspired by Greta and the work that she was doing at a young age and her activism. I was just like, yeah, just incredibly inspired by her no BS attitude and her ability to just talk to, these very powerful people and hold them accountable for their promise. And I found that very incredible. And then as I started working with STF more, I think that Pam, Jordan, and Kristin have had a very deep impact on me because they have taught me everything that I know. And I just have this incredibly deep passion for human rights and have gone to do my own things because of them. And they have given me, like we were talking about earlier, this human rights lens on social justice issues. And because of them, I'm constantly having conversations with family members and my siblings and my friends. And I'm just so thankful for their everything that they put into this organization and into us. It really means a lot. So thank you.
Ren?
Definitely, for one, Kristin and Pam have been phenomenal throughout, my STF experience, and I'm so grateful to be here because of them. Another person that I've definitely drawn a lot of inspiration from is Haijun Han, who is actually a researcher with Human Rights Watch that I met at the Voices for Justice dinner last year, and she's a researcher on children's rights, specifically related to technology. And I just remember that before I left, when I was saying all my goodbyes, she gave us this piece of advice to just keep going and to just keep pursuing human rights and human rights education, no matter where I am and no matter how many people tell me that I won't be able to do it or I should stop because it's not going to make me money or, for all of these reasons, to just keep going. And I think she is just so inspirational for that because as someone who shares a similar background and cultural background to her, I definitely get that all the time of, human rights really shouldn't be your priority right now. You should be focusing on school. You should be focusing on this, and that. And I think that it's so important to remember that at the end of the day, we're all fighting for the same thing and to persevere even when others have doubt in you.
Okay, so what is a quote that effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights? And we'll start with Clementine.
Can you come back to me?
Okay, then we'll go over to Kristin.
Honestly, lately I've been really motivated whenever Michael Jackson's song Man in the Mirror comes on my playlist. Those lyrics just remind me that each individual can be an instigator of change and progress and can have real impact on the world around them. That you don't have to be everywhere or do everything, but just look at yourself and give back to the world what you would like in return. So that's not exactly a quote, but the lyrics of that song are summing up my current views on human rights.
Okay, Pam.
Well, back to Eleanor. I think it's a favorite quote of many actually teachers that I know. And it's back in, I think, was it 1948? Bill, you know this, I'm sure, really well. It's in 1948, or was it 58, when she was talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it's where, after all, do universal human rights begin? And just to shorten it up, they begin in the small places close to home, like the school and the office and the neighborhood. It goes on. But that's, I think, what we've been, it's almost a theme of your discussion with this, Bill, is that it's not some far off thing that happens in the UN only or on some battlefield or someplace off in far from us. It really begins here at home. And if it doesn't begin with us, as Eleanor says, and if it doesn't begin with us and have meaning with us, it won't have meaning anywhere. So that would have to be mine.
Okay, Ren.
So mine comes from Desmond Tutu. I've been a big fan of his advocacy and his, words of wisdom, and specifically the one that I looked to when looking at these questions was, "My humanity is bound up in yours, but we can only be human together." which is a theme that we've talked about a lot in our hour together about remembering the humanity in others when we're talking about human rights.
Okay, Clementine, do you have a quote?
Yes, so this is not exactly a quote, but it's something that I remember a close friend of mine who was a year above me, but she was kind of the reason why I joined STF in the first place. I didn't really know what it was, and she was part of it. And so, yeah, she told me something along the lines of human rights is so much bigger than you think it is. It's everywhere. And that's kind of something that stuck with me because as someone that didn't really understand what human rights was, her talking about how it impacts everything and everyone, yeah, was
Okay.
very impactful.
I thought all four of those were terrific. And our last question is, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education in the United States, what would you do? Kristin, you're first.
I hope I don't take Pam's, but require a course on human rights education that includes direct service and policy advocacy as a graduation requirement in every public and private K through 12 school.
Okay, Pam, you're next.
Well, in fact, that is what I was going to say. We talked about this earlier. We've worked on this issue so much that I think we've come to similar conclusions. But after all the children in the United States go through our schools, one kind of school or another. And if the teachers they met in those schools could talk to them about what human rights mean and give them some kind of idea about their role in this whole scheme of humanity and human rights, what a different world I think it would be. Because oftentimes it's just being able to have the words to be able to explain, okay, I have a right to this. That person over there has a right to be treated fairly, and there's something I can do about that. Pretty powerful.
Agreed. Ren?
Definitely similar to Pam and Kristin's, but I think it would just be diversifying the literature and the experiences that we incorporate in our education curriculums, especially in English heavy classes, diversifying the type of literatures we read, especially to include biographies, memoirs from authors who have gone through experiences that are definitely human rights related. That would be not only humanizing, but also exposes so many students to different perspectives and different cultures that they haven't seen before.
Okay, Clementine.
Yes, so my answer is also kind of similar, but I think just making sure that there is human rights education in the curriculum in the first place. Because like we talked about in schools, there isn't really that language or that understanding of what human rights is and how it impacts everyone. So just making sure that it's there in the first place and integrating it into most subjects, because I really think it does influence the way that you view the world once you have a better understanding of human rights. So yeah.
Well, that's great. And I think that the people who will listen to this podcast, I think, will be very, very influenced by the comments from the people that you have trained, Kristin and Pam, and that's Ren, Clementine, and hundreds of others you've worked. I looked on your website and saw all those alumni. Your impact is enormous because it will extend beyond the faces that are on the webpage to the people they touch and they speak with, and all the people that Ren and Clementine will impact as they move forward. So thanks very much for being with us, and I hope that you have enjoyed participating in this conversation.
Thank you, Bill, for inviting us.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
It's our pleasure. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Kristi@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Kristi Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.